Well, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. If we've not met, I'm Kevin Roberts, have the privilege of serving as Executive Director of the Texas Public Policy Foundation. During this unprecedented time in American history, you know that we've made a custom of meeting each Monday at noon, Texas time, and having guests who have made decisions of their own, will be making decisions of their own that affect American society. And it is a distinct pleasure to have a conversation today with former Florida governor and great American patriot, Jeb Bush. Governor, thanks for joining us today.
It's a joy to be with you guys. I've always been an admirer of the work across the spectrum of policy of your organization, and happy to see that you continue to thrive.
Well, thanks a lot. And I imagine our Texas audience knows this. We do have a few hundred people, I'm sure, tuning in from outside Texas, but really important to say as I sit here in the state capital of Austin, you're a native Texan and a fellow Longhorn alum, so always good to have another University of Texas guy here on the live stream with us today.
Absolutely, and I'm also the proud father of y'all's land commissioner. So
that's it. That's correct. And as you and I were just chatting, Commissioner Bush and TVPF do a lot of work together. We're real proud of the work that he's doing. So I know you're a proud father and grandfather. So aside from real sincere gratitude to you and your service to your state and your country, you and I are planning a conversation today that will come to touch on education, but we thought we might start with some more general conversation about the situation we're in. I know you to be an optimist, someone who certainly reads reality truthfully, as we like to say, but you do that with an optimistic lens, and that may be a little challenging right now, but I know that you're probably still going to do that. Before we get into some specific policy questions, Governor, about education and some other policy areas, I'm just curious, given your leadership experience as the two-term governor of Florida, a state that's prone to natural disasters, what your general thoughts are about the coronavirus crisis, both on the public health side and the economic side.
Well, it's the greatest challenge of our time. We had 8 hurricanes and 4 tropical storms in 16 months, about $200 billion of losses, both public, insured and uninsured losses. And I thought that was a big deal. But when you combine this pandemic that impacts every sector, every part of our society, as well as the entire economy, it's important. Public leadership matters a lot these days. And what I learned was that you have to be optimistic. You have to be transparent. You can't you have to tell people what's going on and give them hope that life will get better, because it normally does. You have to anticipate the problems that you can, if you think about them, you know what the next set of problems and challenges are going to be, to prepare people, and you lead through it. And it's better done from a bottom-up point of view, in my mind, than from a top-down point of view.
Sure. And you know us at the Texas Public Policy Foundation well enough to know that that's been our mantra since day one of this crisis, that, of course, there's a role for the federal government in response to a natural disaster or a crisis like this of public health. But states, to your point, and as evidenced by your leadership when you were governor of Florida, really are on the front lines of that very properly. And I'm curious, it's sort of a two-part question about federalism. One is, are there, and there's not a political statement, obviously, because we're a nonpartisan think tank, although we're unabashedly conservative, are there some states, are there some governors that you think have sort of distinguished themselves with a proper understanding of federalism and really taking the lead when it comes to states doing what they can to help mitigate the effects of this crisis?
Yeah, I mean, there's some good examples of public leadership, and whether or not they're what they're proposing in terms of policy changes and all that, that's not that'll be a fight for into the future. But I'll tell you, Cuomo, if you watch his press conferences, here's a guy who tells it like he sees it. He's data driven. He shows this PowerPoint presentation. He speaks to it. It's pretty impressive. He has good humor. If you like New York humor, it's pretty good. He connects with people on a human level. This is not all about data, and it's easy to walk out in a crisis like this because there's so many data points that are really important. And one of our challenges right now is to figure out what the hell, I mean, where's the denominator? How do we know what kind of problem we have if we don't know the baseline of the number of people infected? Because this great country of ours seems to be incapable, for whatever reason, to be able to provide tests. So in that kind of challenge, the leadership that Governor Cuomo has shown, I think, is pretty good. Governor DeWine in Ohio has been a very effective leader. There have been mayors I've seen across the country that have stepped up. They're doing the things that I think are important in terms of public leadership. They're showing their heart. They're giving people the facts. They're saying this is what it's going to look like going forward, and this is how we bend the curve, the new term, or this is how we're going to get through this. And when we get through it, we're going to be better off because of it. That kind of leadership is more exemplified, I think, at the local and state level than it is in D.C., which, and I'm not being critical of the president or any of the political leaders there, but they're in such a hyper-partisan environment up there that everything is viewed through the lens of not of serving, of service, but of how do I win the news hour, you know? And both sides are playing that game, and it's hard to get out of it because they've been doing it now progressively for the last decade, and it's gotten really ugly, I think.
It really has. What I thought we might do after these introductory comments and talking about education, and before we get to audience questions in a while, is talk a little bit about the future of civil society and to sort of preview that for people. I know one of the things that I'm worried about is that level of partisanship. I have seen that just deepen this crisis. It's a disappointment. I would say not a total surprise, but obviously, you know, many members of Congress, we work with many members of Congress with our office in DC, and I know they are frustrated, you know, members of both parties, that here we are, one of the greatest challenges in American history. I don't think that's hyperbole to say now. And we're seeing almost every policy solution or proposed solution through the lens of partisanship. It's beyond frustrating. And for, you know, for an organization at TVPF, beyond our policy work, that prides itself in trying to personify, to exemplify at least, civil discourse and being cheerful warriors even when we disagree. I know that there are scores of Americans on both sides of the ideological spectrum who are pretty fed up with what they're seeing in DC, kind of on both sides.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. And I don't think the contagion has spread as dramatically to local and state governments. If you watch Governor Abbott or Governor DeSantis or Democratic governors, there's a natural inclination to work across the aisle in a time when people really want to see the hyper-partisanship subside. It doesn't, you know, you can stay true to your beliefs as a conservative and believing in limited government and in personal responsibility, but you can be respectful of the other side and vice versa. But in Washington, fueled by a press that is viewed, you know, is all focused on, did Trump win today or lose today? It's got to be really frustrating to be working at the White House right now. I mean, they have a huge challenge in front of them, and everything is viewed from a political lens. Well, my advice to anybody that's in public life today, the best politics is being a servant, having a servant's heart, because that's what people want right now. They desperately want it. They're scared. They're worried about their future. They're now, you know, think of how many millions of parents are teaching their children, in many cases without any help from school districts, because school districts across this country, believe it or not, are saying, some of them are saying, if we can't provide access to the internet, access to education through the internet to everyone, we're not going to provide it to anyone in the district. I mean, that's a wake-up call for a lot of parents that are struggling to make sure their kids don't fall behind. They don't want to hear the partisanship. They want solutions. I don't know if you follow Mark Andreessen, the venture capital guy. He just wrote an incredible piece that I recommend to your to your members. It's basically his call to action is, let's build it. Let's stop talking about things that are not relevant. Let's build the new America. In every crisis and every downturn, there has been an incredible burst of innovation, of creativity, of transformation. And public leaders can play a significant role of fixing the things that aren't working. I mean, does it make any sense that our supply chain for pandemic response is dependent on China? Does it make any sense that it takes years to get a vaccine done, even in an emergency? Does it make any sense to see that we can't find gloves and masks, that we didn't have a proper stockpile, that we don't train for pandemics anymore, and we used to do it? All these things just cry out for building a new America. And I am an optimist, and I think if we don't obsess about what goes on in the cable news channels in D.C. and focus on how do we build a better America, I think what's going to happen.
Yeah, that's well said. So where can our audience find that piece that you just recommended?
Oh man, I got so many places I get information. He's Andreessen Horowitz is the name of the venture capital firm.
Okay.
I'll find it and I'll send it to you.
Sounds good. And we'll send it out to audience and get it up all on our social media feeds. And that's really been the thrust of our messaging over the last few weeks is, you know, cautious optimism. We don't want to be dismissive of the reality of the public health threat. And yet we also understand that there will be a time when we return to something that looks like normal. Parts of that have probably been permanently changed, as has happened in American history sometimes. But what should not change, to your point, is, and perhaps should be even amplified, is our commitment to one another in a true nonpartisan way, whatever or however deep our philosophical differences may be. And I'm hopeful and even prayerful that that will happen. You mentioned something that will be the focus for the next several moments of our conversation, and that's education policy. And obviously, among other things, achievements as governor of Florida, you really led on education reform, as I know many of our audience members know. I'm curious, just sort of pick up on what you just mentioned about education reform and the inability of some school districts to, maybe even unwillingness of some school districts to participate in the new normal. What you think the opportunities are for education reform as a result of this crisis?
Well, I think there's a couple of things that are going to become clear. Parents have never been as deeply involved in their children's education as they have in the last month. Literally millions of parents, whether they like it or not, are learning math and social studies, and they're seeing the quality when it exists, and they're seeing, you know, sadly, they're seeing the lack of quality in some areas. I think parents informed by that kind of information will be empowered to say, no, I want higher expectations for my child. I want to be more engaged in my child's learning. I want to have more of a choice about where my children go to school. I think all of those things are a natural byproduct of being engaged and less passive. That could be really exciting. On the technology side, I'm sure most moms and dads are saying, gosh, you know, I'm happy my kid is going to go back to a traditional classroom, but maybe we could harness this technology so that we can accelerate the learning. Maybe we can customize the learning experience in a way that we're not holding kids back. We spend a lot of time, and Florida is probably the leader in the country in terms of our success in dealing with the kids that had historically been left behind, the lower achieving kids. Not many states have really focused on high achieving kids. Imagine a system where time was the variable and learning was the constant. If 25% of all 11th graders are capable of taking college level coursework and only 3 or 4% do, that's kind of a question of that all of us should probably say, well, why not? Why can't we make sure that you have a proliferation of AP classes and other classes where students are garnering college credit in their last year of high school, and that the kids that are struggling aren't just pushed along? I think this whole period of pause, you know, where we're in this quarantine, is going to allow for new thinking to emerge, and technology will certainly be part of that. The final thing I'd say is, you know, that the trends that existed before the coronavirus impacted millions and millions of Americans, I think will accelerate. And one of those, Texas is a leader in that regard as well, is how do we make sure that not only are students college ready when they graduate from high school, but career ready? Can we find ways to have nationally recognized certification programs embedded in classrooms so that students can actually get a relevant job going forward, maybe with an AS degree, AA degree, or right out of high school working in a place where skills matter. Maybe out of this, you're going to find that colleges are not as relevant as they were in the 20th century. Maybe it's the skills that are acquired in all sorts of different ways that really matters for employers. So if you do believe that the things that we've relied on need to be brought into the 21st century and made more relevant, and I believe that passionately, I think this is a great opportunity because people have seen it now closer up front, and it's not as pretty as it should be.
No, that's true. Well, I have a few follow-up questions about education and really sort of go along the series of K-12 education, community colleges, and other institutions of higher education. But on K-12 education, Florida very early under your leadership became a leader in virtual education. In fact, I believe the Florida Virtual School Network is the largest in the country. I read something recently that suggested, and maybe it's already happened, that the number of students enrolled in that network will increase from several 100,000 to a few million over the next few months. I'm curious if you would mention to our audience how that network got its start, what the present situation is, and what the future looks like.
So Florida Virtual School was founded the year before I became governor, and we expanded it dramatically. It's not a network per se, it's an actual entity, a not-for-profit entity that grew exponentially, then pulled back and is growing again. And in this crisis, it's actually, provided some interesting services. For example, I met the Commissioner of Education from Alaska who traveled down to Miami to visit. I was very flattered that he would come all the way down there to talk, and we talked about the Florida Virtual School, and then I read in the paper that because of that connection, now Florida Virtual is offering online courses in conjunction with Alaska teachers that otherwise they wouldn't have. They didn't have that bandwidth. And so imagine Alaska with all its remote areas using virtual education to keep children on track for learning. So there's, look, the internet doesn't have, state boundaries. The idea of finding qualified teachers should be viewed differently, should be viewed in a 21st century way. We get tied to the old way of thinking, and the old way of thinking would be you have to be certified in every state. Well, in states, I don't know what Texas does, but in Florida, we have reciprocity. If you've been certified in one state, we don't make it impossible for you to be certified in ours. What we're looking for are high quality teachers, and all this regulatory morass on top of learning, I think, impedes progress.
Well, I tell you, one of the things that's been disappointing here in Texas is to see one of the groups that defends the status quo issuing a press release and letter last week basically saying that there ought be no future for virtual education for Texas's 6 million plus students. Is there any merit to that from a policy point of view, or is that just pure political posturing?
Look, if you're in rural Texas or even in the big urban areas, if you mine the data that exists, you would find that there are some incredible AP teachers in Austin, for example, but there may not be an AP physics teacher near Austin. Why wouldn't you want to have high quality online learning spread out so that every child could access it? If you go to the urban core schools in Texas, I can guarantee you the caliber, not the caliber of teachers, but the array of offerings is limited compared to the suburban parts of Texas. We learned that in Florida pretty quick, and we dramatically changed the dynamic. We trained teachers to teach AP classes in the urban core areas so that they would be more offerings. And the net result is that there's a lot of high achieving, lower income kids that are garnering a better quality education because we took all that mythology and said that's nonsense. Every child should have access to high quality education, and virtual learning is one of many ways that you can provide that.
Sure. So moving forward with the progress in education, or level of education rather, I want to ask you a question about the community college structure in Florida. And of course, in no way I know you're not, impugning the motives of people who are public school teachers or community college professionals. I started my teaching career as a historian at Austin Community College and remain just very, very focused on supporting that noble mission. But the point of the question is, here in Texas, from a workforce development point of view, we find that the community colleges have programs and are getting funding for programs that often have nothing to do with the workforce needs in their particular area. And in Texas, that has become a significant enough problem that reforming that system was already on our foundation's legislative priority list for next session. It's now a top priority because money will be so scarce, even here in Texas. I'm curious if in Florida you have a system of community colleges that addresses those workforce needs more efficiently than we do.
You know, we have, our community colleges are performance driven. The budgets have consistently, for many years now, been performance driven. We still have the, and so that in that sense, they deliver at a very low cost, really important degree programs that are relevant. But there still is this mindset that you're describing of oversupply of students in certain courses where the pay is too low and where there's an abundance of supply of there isn't a shortage of jobs. So new intermediaries, including community colleges, focusing on higher wage jobs is now a higher priority in Florida as well. And I encourage you guys to do that. If you look at the data, and it's easy to get, you'll find that there are severe shortages of positions where the wages are significantly higher than the median in any community. And the ability to provide a credential or an AS or AA degree is the best alternative, low-cost alternative with the best results if you change the governance structure. And I think there's a lot of great private entities doing the same thing as well. We're so focused on protecting systems rather than organizing around outcomes. That's the frustration. That's kind of the Mark Andreessen point of view that I embrace. If it's not working, build the new way to make it work. And don't tear down the institutions that existed for many years, but encourage them through funding and through proper incentives to be able to be part of the solution in the 21st century.
Oh, that's so well said. I think as our staff here at the foundation and I have talked about the opportunity that exists for everybody, not just conservatives, but we're conservatives, so I'm talking about us, to advance reform ideas. There's a silver lining to this crisis from a policy point of view. It's that those decisions will have to be made. I mean, the scarcity of resources will be so significant at the federal but particularly the state levels that I think it's going to force some of those good decisions that defending the status quo, defending the systems has really gotten in the way of. And so last question about education before prompting our audience to submit some questions online is about four-year colleges and universities. Obviously, if we're talking about systems that need reform, I think we'd both agree that system is ripe for reform. We spend a lot of time looking at student debt. We also spend a lot of time looking at the accreditation cartel, where you've got these private organizations that protect the status quo rather than incentivize innovation. I'm curious whether as governor or in the time you've spent since working on education reform, if you have priorities for reform for American higher education.
Well, it needs to be reformed if you look at the results. If 60% of full-time equivalent students graduate with a four-year degree in 6 years and increasingly have higher and higher recourse debt loads on their backs without necessarily connecting to a job that makes the debt payable, that you can pay it back, that kind of cries out for reform. And so I think in Florida, Indiana, a few other places, maybe Texas is doing this, the performance system where you basically contract with the state legislature and the executive branch of the state government to provide deliverables, and you get your money when you provide those deliverables, is part of the answer. And it's an important part. And what we found, this was under Governor Scott that this happened, there was significant outcome improvements in terms of graduation rates, degree completion rates at the proper pace. Mm-hmm. So I would encourage more performance accountability in the education systems. In Florida, we also moved, when I was governor, to allowing community colleges to significantly expand four-year degrees. And it was controversial at the time, but it's provided a source of degree completion for a lot of working people that otherwise wouldn't have been able to complete the degree. So I think there's a whole myriad of things that could be done to make higher education more relevant. Because ultimately, you know, what's going to happen is that employers, particularly the new economy employers, are going to say, I don't, you know, it's great that you got a 4-year degree. Tell me what you know. Tell me what you've mastered. Tell me how you think. Tell me how you collaborate with your peers. Those things become more relevant in the 21st century economy. And if the universities haven't adapted to that, they're going to be in perilous shape.
I think that this will be a time of tremendous pruning of trees throughout education, perhaps starting with colleges and universities, and in some cases entire systems of universities in certain states that have just resisted even the smallest of change. And it will be harder and harder, I think, politically for them to defend that as well, because as you pointed out, the results for the student, the benefits for the student from an academic and workforce preparedness point of view have declined while the costs continue to go up. And
yeah, so people look at our higher education system, and there's kind of been a mythology built up that it's the best in the world. You know, it's the best in the world for elite universities where elite students go, I guess. I mean, that's probably true. And those universities will always be around. But the state university system and the college systems provide education for 90+% of all students, many of whom now are not 19-year-olds, they're 30-year-olds. And in that kind of environment, the universities need to, I think, be more dramatic in their efforts and approach, you know, their efforts to change to meet that need. And they're great examples of success in that regard. And then there's some that you just see refuse to change. And those are the ones that you think, I think you're totally right. They will be the roadkill in the post-pandemic era.
Yeah, I'm even hoping for that in some cases, because they've brought that on themselves by being so resistant to change and not just wasting the public's money, but I mean, almost to a fraudulent point of view. And I use that word carefully, but meaningfully, the students who are working very hard to be there, especially those who are a little bit later in life and have less time to make that kind of progress. One last question about that, because it goes back to this theme of federalism in our conversation. Do you think that the federal government's involvement in higher education has accentuated these problems, particularly of cost and decline?
Yeah, I mean, if it wasn't for the student loan program, you wouldn't see, you know, the idea that we have healthcare inflation, somehow that inflation mysteriously is higher for healthcare, or higher education inflation. I mean, that's a mythology built up to try to excuse away the simple fact is that we have very inefficient systems paid for on the backs of students with recourse debt that has exploded. And administrative costs have gone up. The mission creep of universities has accelerated. And you have 60% of full-time equivalent students graduating with a 4-year degree in 6 years in our public university system. Why don't we call it a 6-year degree? I mean, who's fooling who when we say full-time equivalent students now is 12 credit hours rather than 15, and we measure the completion rate in 6 years rather than 4? I mean, these systems have to change. They were changing, the pressure was mounting for them to change prior to the pandemic virus, and this will only accelerate that.
And that will be, as I said, one of the silver linings of this crisis.
Yeah. So here's an idea for you guys. You probably already know this because you guys are wonky as all get out. The number of students in Texas that are 30 credit hours away from getting a 4-year degree, whatever that number is, advocate a plan to make sure that, put it out to bid, do it any way you want, to make sure that there's a low-cost means by which young people, working people, can go back and complete their degree to get a 4-year degree. While it may not be as relevant as it was a decade ago, it's still important, and it's a goal worth. It allows, you know, it helps people view success in a different way when they can complete a degree like that. but they can't do it if they're working two jobs, or they and their spouse are working and they are trying to take care of their kids. They're not going to go back to a brick and mortar university per se. They're going to go in a different way. And that kind of thinking is what should become the norm rather than the exception.
Oh, I love that idea. I don't know that. I'm sure my smart colleagues in higher ed, Dr. Tom Lindsay and Dr. Andrew Gillen do. And I like the timeliness of that proposal, obviously, but also what people may not be thinking about is the college attendance rates during economic downturns, of course, go up. And what an appropriate time to step out of the workforce, at least part-time, and go finish that degree and be more competitive in what's going to be an increasingly competitive workforce. Not a situation that we've had over the last couple of years. Really, employers have been the ones competing against each other. So, Governor, I know you're interested in some audience questions, and we have a few questions that are really germane to the conversation we're having, and we'll kind of go back in order, starting with K-12 and work up to higher ed again. We have an AP, an advanced placement teacher in Dallas, who's asking a question about the future of testing. And they're, I guess, maybe concerned about the amount of time that's spent on standardized tests. I think the assumption in that question must be that we are going to have some sort of permanent change to how even public schools deliver. Maybe there's going to be a hybrid kind of program between traditional classrooms and online. Will testing be affected by that?
You know, this is a great challenge, because you want to measure, you want to have accountability, particularly for low-income kids that traditionally in our country have been left behind. Without accountability, you would see achievement gaps grow to the point where the social strains, I think, become an even bigger challenge for our country. But you can overtest for sure, and the system that today with an end of year or close to an end of year test makes it harder to imagine a system where you customize the learning experience for each child. I mean, let me describe a different system where testing would be done more in real time, or measuring would be done in real time. Imagine a group of 14-year-olds that had grade level aptitudes that were varying based on their, where they stood in their education experience. But the students that mastered the material could move on to the next iteration of material, and students that were lagging behind had to master the material before they moved on. They were the same age, they socialized as 14-year-olds would be, and the next year 15-year-olds and so on. But you would have a system where the gaps would narrow, because the underperforming kids would have to learn the building blocks before they moved on, and they would move on. And the kids that were being held back because you're teaching to the median, if you will, they would be liberated. Using technology effectively in a traditional classroom, teachers could see incredible gains if that was the case. And in that environment, accountability would be different. Assessments would be different. You wouldn't wait till the end of the year to do testing. You would have tools that you would say, this kid has mastered this material, now he can move on to the next set of challenges. It would be, in my mind, a much better approach to accountability. The challenge is, how do we go from this current system to that system without losing accountability altogether? That part is hard. That I don't have the specific answer to that. There's resistance to a new model, and there's resistance to testing of the old model. And in between, we could end up with neither.
Right. And in between is a sea of partisanship that makes it difficult to get anything done, right?
Oh, my God. Now, this is a place where there's a convergence, I think, in some ways for different reasons on the left and the right, to oppose any reforms.
Yeah.
Not a place.
Yeah, some elements of each, and it's fine. I may disagree, but it's the right of people to have that disagreement. Some elements of both the left and right will have different reasons for defending the status quo. And often, even though the Texas Public Policy Foundation is, at least if you read the Austin American Statesman, an arch conservative organization, we find ourselves kind of going between, not because we're fast and loose with our principle, but because we believe that if we can get half of reform done in one session and the other half the next session, that's what we ought to do, all the while keeping our spirit of optimism, particularly for the kids of Texas. So a follow-up question to that, which I think is very thoughtful. I hear this from friends who have kids in private and public schools, and of course those kids are home now. And the question from one of our audience members is, how can parents who are not equipped to teach address this crisis?
Well, first of all, parents have not had the kind of information necessary. They don't know how their teachers are doing or their schools are doing. Generally, that's the case across the country. So I think the first step is to turn parents into informed consumers of their children's education. To know exactly how they're doing compared to other schools, how their child is doing. Imagine, using the end of course exams, the tests that exist today, that if you had a test, what's the name of is it called I forgot, the TSA, whatever it's called in Texas?
Our test.
Yeah. So imagine that test being given to the parent with a letter that says your child fits into, is in the 60th percentile amongst students that took this test, or 90th percentile, whatever. And here are the places where your child excels, and here are the places where over the summer you could help your child improve his math capabilities or reading capabilities or whatever it is. And then that information was also given to the next year's teacher, so that there was a continuum of information that at least put parents on an equal footing, so that they could be informed consumers. I think that's the first step. There are tools available, and many parents are figuring this out right now as they're struggling to make sure. I mean, I would struggle beyond 9th grade math right now. I think. I'm not really good at math in 9th grade, and I'm assuming as a 67-year-old man, I wouldn't be too hot on it. Math has served me well in my adult life, but I would have a hard time teaching a child 9th or 10th grade level math. So there are tools now that didn't exist that long ago that would allow a parent to be a more effective partner with the teacher. But the first step is to have that kind of two-way communication between the school and the parent to extend the learning experience. And this all is available to us today. But if you go online and you try to find out the information of a particular school, unless you're in an extraordinary state, by and large, most states make it impossible. The state of Florida, gosh, I mean, and I was governor, I would have thought I could have changed this, which it's like a gigantic PowerPoint, Excel spreadsheet with a bunch of numbers. It really doesn't say much. It says too much, basically, on how the schools are doing, and it's not customized for each student.
And that's that element of customization is something that we've come to focus on in our own education reform work here at TPPF. Obviously, we were founded on the issue of school choice. And if anything, over the years, while we're just as committed to that as we've always been, we've come to understand that to mean multiple vehicles. You've touched on that in our conversation, and customization is one of them. I'm hopeful that that's one of the things that independent school districts in Texas, school boards, teachers in Texas see as an opportunity from this, that maybe some opportunities that their students could not take advantage of before, that were not available, now are. And I'm hopeful that if we get out of that thinking, all of us, of defending systems, and instead focus on what's best for students, that some good policy may come as a result.
Here's an interesting challenge. Texas won't have to deal with this completely, but Florida will. We have the largest voucher programs in the country, 110,000 more or less corporate tax scholarship kids, money directly out of the funding formula where children can go to private schools. And then we have the McKay Scholarship for kids with learning disabilities. So it totals about 160 or 70,000 students. Private schools are going to be hurt by the coronavirus epidemic, and many of them are going, without state support, are going to close down. The interesting challenge in Florida will be that you're likely to see a whole lot of kids going back to public schools, and all the people that opposed any of this expansion private schools being able to educate students will then complain that they're not getting it because it will cost more to go to the public school than to the private schools. They'll be complaining about that as well. They complained about the expansion of the existence of the programs, the expansion of the programs, and then they'll complain about the programs receding temporarily because of this economic crisis we're facing. If the focus is always on protecting what you have rather than envisioning something better, we'll continue to have these food fights that are really not helping children learn.
Yeah, that's it. The victims in all this, and that's not too strong a word, are students who of course, many of whom continue to suffer under that system thinking rather than thinking that brings on innovation. So one final question about K-12, at least thus far. If you're in the audience and you have some other questions, there's still some time to submit some questions online in the comments box. This is a question again about sort of taking concerns about standardization, standardized testing, academic standards, and your comment earlier about workforce training. And this questioner is asking, is K-12 only about workforce training, or is there still an opportunity to sort of learn the basics, what this questioner is phrasing as academic integrity?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's in fact, I would be deeply troubled if a child graduates from high school only being given an opportunity to be focused on some career type learning. You know, you want children to be able to read and to write and to communicate effectively, have a sense of history, have a knowledge of our heritage as a nation, learn about intellectual curiosity, be curious as human beings if they're to be successful in life, and a well-rounded education can achieve that. But at the same time, you want to make sure that students are career ready as well. It's not either or. In fact, I think one of the challenges for career-oriented education is people view it as vocational education, kind of in the back of the school, and it doesn't have to be that way. You can learn a lot of things that I just described also along the way, learning the beginning building blocks, at least, of a career-oriented education. I don't see it as a zero-sum game at all.
It really is, and I remember, and we were chatting about this before we went live, in my career leading a K-12 liberal arts school and a liberal arts college, that sometimes we would get the question from prospective students, especially prospective dads, asking the dad question, well, what in the wide world of sports is my little Johnny going to do with this liberal arts degree? And I would always show those folks that there'd be two things that happen. The Wall Street Journal has been the biggest proponent of making sure that K-12 education focuses on what this questioner is calling academic integrity, but that's not in contest necessarily with also being career ready. And I think that's the key, is that we make sure that our K-12 objectives are aligned with the mission of our community colleges and our 4 or now 6-year universities, as you might suggest. And those are the opportunities that we have here in Texas. And basically doing that is one of the major thrusts of TPPF's legislative agenda for 2021. So, Governor, we've sort of exhausted things about education, and I think our audience may be interested in hearing more general thoughts about the crisis that we're in. We spent a few moments kind of diagnosing it, complaining, I think, legitimately about partisanship. I'm curious about a couple of thoughts about your crystal ball. The first is, let's just say, hypothetically, you were advising a policymaker, a governor, a county judge, mayor, about how to reopen their jurisdiction. What kinds of data, what kinds of metrics are you looking for that would help you balance the public health crisis with what is absolutely an economic crisis as well?
Yeah, this is the frustration of this crisis, is that we haven't tested enough people to get a full. We don't know the number. Right now in America, 20% of people that have been tested are testing positive. Well, that could mean a lot of different things, because the denominator is not large enough to get a full impact of this. There's a study done by Stanford in Santa Clara County, adjacent to where Stanford is, that suggests that the number was far less, that the number is actually close to, the infection rates are closer to what the common flu brings. But that study is being challenged, peer-reviewed and challenged. And so I think the first step is, man, these are tough decisions, and you've got to be careful that you have the appropriate data to make the decisions. And right now, I don't think most places have it. So first thing is to create, and this is where the national government can play a huge role, is to create a national strategy for testing. It can help us identify people that have immunity that can then go back to work. It'll allow for the ability to isolate folks that are infected more appropriately, that won't overwhelm the hospital system. And then in a cautious way, you can reopen the economy in places where the probability of infection or interaction is limited. And I think that's what states are struggling with and trying to figure out, but they're doing so without all of the data, which has got to be really frustrating. And if Washington could do one thing, it would be to solve that. That would be huge. And once we solve that, I think we get beyond this pretty quick.
Sure. In Texas, Governor Abbott's zealously focused on that, and we're still waiting for the data. The data that we do have, and it is limited, would suggest that we don't have nearly the public health crisis that perhaps some in the media might suggest. But as you said, until you have more airtight data, it's a little hard, especially when you're dealing with a very populous state here, as you know well, being in Florida, to say all 30 million Texans can return to work at once. So what I'm anticipating is that there will be some sort of phased in reopening, and each week maybe getting a little more data, more testing to be able to verify that in fact this remains a good idea to reopen.
And I would suggest the other suggestions would be publicly use your bully pulpit to establish what the protocols are for schools, for example. Imagine, if we don't open up schools at some point, probably starting in August or depending on the state, September, if somehow there's a movement not to open up schools, then how are people going to go back to work? It would be devastating for the economy. There has to be a way to create a safe environment for students to go back to school. And there ought to be clear protocols that are established that give parents the information necessary for them to make decisions about their child's education, as well as educators. Similarly, there should be protocols about how businesses open by sector. They're going to be different in a restaurant than it's going to be than a warehouse or an office building. But again, in the public leadership realm, providing that information after vetting it with business leaders that are thinking about this would be a way to accelerate opening up of the economy as well. The third thing is that there's likely to be big budget challenges for state governments. I can't imagine with a biannual budget that was booming and the oil and gas sector being hurt as much as it is right now. This is an opportunity to, it's going to be tough, but this is an opportunity of transformation and reform as well. It shouldn't be to backfill for programs that weren't working, but to envision a chance to build new capacity for students and for people that are going to lose their jobs and maybe could be upskilled. There's lots of opportunities that'll exist. And using the state budget, I think, is the means by which you could accelerate that kind of improvement. And then, look, I think you always have to you have to be honest about the rocky climb up the hill. Mm-hmm. You have to give the impression correctly that we're all in it together. That not just the elites or some fancy group of people that are sheltered. They're not, they're going to be fine. But everybody, because we're in it together, everybody is going to get over that hill. And on the other side of that hill, there's a lush green valley full of opportunity and hope. If you're moping around as a public leader and saying, someone else's fault, the end is near, it's not fair, it doesn't inspire anybody to do the right things. Because ultimately, if people decide that they are going to follow the best advice because it's in their interest to do so, it'll accelerate the recovery. And if they don't feel like the system is working for them and they don't trust the information they're getting, then they're going to create behaviors that's going to make the recovery far harder.
Yeah, as we know, and certainly our audience would agree, human freedom's irrepressible. Even the most oppressive governments in history have not been completely successful in suppressing that. And what we're trying to do from a policy point of view is make sure that by maximizing human freedom, there is the information for us as individuals to make the most prudent decisions we can. I know we're all very much looking forward to that day. So one final question from the audience, and then I'll ask my final question before we wrap up. And the final question from the audience is sort of a looking ahead question. It comes from one of our sister think tanks, the Pelican Institute in Louisiana, obviously a hotspot for the virus and a place where there can be some significant reform as a result. And their question is, what can schools and state governments do to close the digital divide so students have access to the technology they need?
Great question, and one of great frustration. If you think about the amount of money that state budgets have for technology and school districts, it's ginormous. I mean, look, our country spends more per student than any country in the world, more per student. I actually said that when I was running for president, and I got PolitiFacted. You ever follow that? You know, where some reporter becomes the judge and jury. And they said, well, it's partially true. It's not true. It wasn't a four-alarm fire or whatever, or Pinocchio, whatever it was called. But it was not true because the Benelux countries, Luxembourg and Belgium, spend more per student. Okay, fine. That Benelux's countries have less students than Harris County.
Yeah.
Put in perspective. So we spend a lot of money, but it is vendor driven. There's not a strategy in place. And then you add on top of that the E-rate monies that are a tax on every cell phone and usage. You could create a national strategy. The president's advocated a $2 trillion infrastructure plan. I haven't seen the details flushed out, which is if we're spending money, that would not be a bad place to spend it in 21st century infrastructure to get the economy back on track would be smart. Why not create a national strategy implemented locally to be able to make sure that everybody has access to the internet in the next 2 years? It defies common sense that the amount of money, it's not the money we spend, it's how we spend the money that impedes that. And I think given the challenges that we face today, where they're literally, fancy school districts, affluent neighborhoods, but where 20% of their kids may be at or near the poverty level, are saying we're not going to provide content over the internet because everybody can't access it. Shame on them. The answer should have been, let's figure out a way to make sure that those 20% that can't afford access to the internet have the ability to do so. Strategy around it, and that's I think what the new thinking has to be based on that, and then reallocating the money in a more appropriate fashion.
Yeah, there was a time when I would have had sort of a knee-jerk reaction against that idea about taking internet to rural America, but now I think it may be the way to save rural America.
Absolutely, and the First Step program, that's the law enforcement program that AT&T is running, I guess, that is providing bandwidth access to the rural areas combined with E-rate. There's a great opportunity to be able to, and not just survive the rural areas. We could see a cultural change where people say, hey, the wide open spaces don't look so bad right now. The social distancing thing may be good for my health. And rural areas may see a renaissance if they have that 21st century infrastructure to rely on. As my wife jokes with our neighbors, we homeschool our 4 kids, live out in the Texas Hill Country. We just lead the quarantine life permanently. It's a beautiful thing. Doesn't mean that we're antisocial or don't get into Austin, but I'm hopeful that maybe this urbanization, which I don't think is great for America, it's certainly not great for those of us who have conservative principles, maybe dissipate some, and we see sort of a return to that community-oriented country that existed for so long. And that's actually this point that you made is a good segue into my last question for you, and that is,
once the dust settles on this crisis, Governor, what's going to be different about America? What's going to be the same about America? And based on those two things, what words of encouragement would you give us, our members of audience, in spite of the challenges that we're facing?
You know, I'll answer that. It's a great question. I've been giving this a lot of thought, and whenever I speak about this, I'm confused about whether these are my hopes or my beliefs. So it may be a combination of both. I do think that we'll go back to being more of a bottom-up country. That in this period of crisis, people have had to rely on things that they've kind of ignored for a while, like intact families, like community organizations that they could rely on to get through this. You know, the efforts of restaurants to stay open, to provide and receive donations from people so that they could provide food for healthcare workers. There's thousands of different things that are bubbling up from the bottom up. My wife and I have been going to Mass every day, you know, and it's very easy to do. You just go online. And I love the homilies. They're much better than, don't tell my priest. He's a great guy, but this guy, this guy out in California is phenomenal. I don't know if you follow Word on Fire, but
oh, sure. Yeah, Baron.
I mean, so there's a, you know, long-winded answer is we're finding ways to reconnect with the things that are timeless, the things that are really important. Our country was not founded on a muscular or inefficient, incompetent national government. It was founded from the bottom up. And so my hope and my belief is that a return to more bottom-up principles will become the norm. I think it actually may lead to more rewards politically for competency and solutions-oriented kind of approaches. I think if you look at the politicians that are offering solutions and capable leadership, their numbers are going up, and others that seem to want to stay focused on the food fight have not seen that kind of gain. And that's a hope, maybe more than a reality. Maybe we go back to the hyper-partisanship, but I think there's going to be rewards for solutions. And then I do hope, and this is more of a hope, that this will be a catalyst for a more positive, optimistic, hopeful belief that we should stop fearing the unknown, we should embrace it, and focus on 21st century solutions. As a conservative, I would want to have those be conservative principles of limited government, personal responsibility, allow innovation to take hold in a way that allows the human condition to move forward, that people have a chance to rise up again, and that our spirits are lifted again. So you tell me, I'm not sure if that's a prediction or a hopeful belief. It really doesn't matter, because we have the chance, all of us together, to form that future. If we sit on the sidelines, I can guarantee you what the result's going to be. It's not a pretty one.
That's exactly. I don't know if it's prediction or something else. What it is encouraging, which I know our audience wants to hear, and they themselves want to implement personally. We try to end each of these primers with some words of encouragement for people, and I know that yours will be very well received. Our audience will be grateful for them. I think your point about sitting on the sidelines is crucial too, because my hope and prayer about another silver lining from this crisis is that this problem of civic apathy goes away. That actually goes hand in hand, as you understand well, with partisanship. In other words, the fewer people who are involved means that you allow a smaller and smaller number of people to dictate the terms. And I'm hopeful that maybe we will all be energized, sort of revitalized as American patriots, regardless of our philosophical differences, to get more involved. So Governor Jeb Bush, I can't thank you enough for your time, for your wisdom, for your leadership. Really appreciate your being on this live stream today.
Thank you. Thanks. Continue the great work.
Thanks a lot. And for those of you who've joined us in the audience, thanks so much for being friends of TPPF. May you have a great week. God bless you. God bless America.